Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is my video of how I painted red flower in the sun. Red flower in the sun came from my stash of hundreds of photographs that I've taken of my garden, other people's gardens too. I like to focus in sharp on one beautiful flower, try it in different angles and in different lighting. Every once in a while I get a beautiful photo, and it's not every time, believe me. But if you take a lot of photos, you're bound to get a good one sometime. This one even had rays of light coming down from the sunshine and sort of focusing on the flower, which were very pretty. So, here we go. I hope you enjoy it. Give it a thumbs up. And now let's paint. Sometimes I don't like to confine myself to pencil with drawing. So for this painting, I diluted some cadmium red with a lot of water and just sketched the outside of the flower form with a paintbrush and some cadmium red. I figure if I messed up, flowers are pretty forgiving, so I could just fix it. This flower had a lot of folds, also had a lot of detail and veins. It was broken into shades. Quite interesting with the light. So I found the light to be a fun challenge to work with for this painting. Now there's a mess up, so I painted it out with water and pressed on it with my brush and my paper towel. Most of it came out. Since my background is fairly dark, I can paint over mess-ups and they won't really show. Now, section by section, I am painting the background. Each section that I have showing, I've wet with water and left some areas where I didn't paint because I didn't want the paint to run into every place. I wanted some areas to be a little lighter. Now I'm dropping in the paint. For this random garden picture, I'm using the colors Viridian, I'm using Hooker's Green Dark mixed with indigo, I'm using sap green. I'm even putting in a little bit of the cadmium red. When that mixes with the green and the yellow that I'm putting in, it creates just a touch of tie-in to the flower itself without being overly bright. I want to get good and dark because some areas of this background were quite dark, and I want to set off the brightness of the red with the strong darks. Here I'm doing a little bit of blotting to lift some color so everything wasn't quite as dark. And moving on to the next section of background. I'm also putting some salt on the wet paint of the background to add some additional texture. The salt has to be put on while it's damp and not soaking wet and not dry. And if it works, it makes a beautiful crystalline type of structure texture. The last section of the painting background is the largest one on the top. There's a tree line, there's some light colored sky showing through. And there's some beautiful colors that are coming through in the background. I'm putting everything down just a little brighter than I think it should be. The reason being, it will fade. And as watercolor fades as it dries, and it all does it, it won't be as bright. Now, if you want to go bright at the beginning, it's not going to fade as much. But it's always good and fine to add additional color in glazes after it dries, and that's what I will be doing here. Now you can see I'm adding some magenta, some violet, some cadmium yellow, more spray of water so it will be nice and wet. And now I'm coming in with my greens. Viridian, Hooker's Green Dark, Sap Green, and I'm coming in with some turquoise, which I think will go nicely with the red of the flower and the orangey sections of the flower. Now you can see I'm painting around little circular areas to keep them lighter. And hopefully I will soften the edges of these so they'll be soft focus later in the painting. Adding a little salt to the last section of the background. Tapping in a little bit of extra color. You can see how I'm using my hand to shield the rest of the painting, because I don't want to tap color where I don't want the color going. Now I've been a little sloppy, so I have some splatters on the flower, and I'm cleaning them up. Back to the flower, I'm going in to structure my petals and areas of light a little more clearly so I can copy them easier from my photograph reference. I want to make sure I preserve my lightest colors paramount. Then my second lightest colors, really important to me in creating this painting. If everything's the same tone and dark, it's not going to be as dynamic or interesting, or I should say, not what I'm aiming to convey. And it could be quite wonderful if somebody else is trying to convey a more mid-toned painting. I'm trying to convey one that's really lit by strong light. And that's why I'm trying so hard to preserve these light areas. So I continue to use light-colored, washed-out paint to draw in with my brush the areas that I want to paint section by section to try to create this lovely flower in the garden. Now I'm beginning to paint in my actual flower petals. I've chosen a retreating petal toward the back for my first one. I'm using a fairly solid paint color for this particular section, and I'm using Quin Red mixed with a little bit of Quin Coral. And going through, painting the next sections bit by bit. Where the color gets a lot more orangey or melon color, that's where I'm starting with the Quin Coral and adding some cadmium yellow. I'm making my colors quite concentrated and bright. And of course I can lift color if they're too bright, or if they don't have enough light at their center. Generally, flowers are darker around the edges of the petals and lighter toward the center. At least that's my observation. Take a look next time you're looking at an image of a flower. See what you think. Where you see me making some really much lighter colors is where I've added water to my brush. And I'm painting around the darker edges, adding some water, such as I did just now, to the middle. So it will softly gradate from a lighter color to a darker color. And so this whole flower is being built section by section and petal by petal. Again, almost like a watercolor jigsaw puzzle. It is sort of a relaxing way to paint. And I did enjoy painting this red flower in the sun. Look at all the water mixing in with that color section of paint. As I try to pull in the structure of the petals with the veins going through. The edge of petals is very frequently light. The edges are frequently light. So I'm leaving this edge pale. I'll go back in later and soften it some. But I'm using all of my really pretty colors, my Quin red, my Quin violet, my Quin coral, and some cadmium yellow. In a couple sections, the shadowed areas look almost purple, and that's where I'm bringing in the Quin violet to let it mix with the Quin red. When I say Quin, what I mean is quinacridone. Quinacridone. It's hard for me to say, so you can laugh at my pronunciation if you want. Sometimes I do. But that is the color family that I'm talking about in the chemical formula. Quinacridone. We'll stick with Quin. So there's a lot of orange in this coloring right here, and peach. And then I will be going into it with some Quin violet, which will create an almost mauve type of color. That's a color I think goes really nicely with yellows and with reds. You could see what you think. You can also see as one color begins to dry in one section, I will frequently go back into that section when I have more color on my brush and drop some additional paint there and glaze another layer on to get the brilliance and the brightness that I want. Here I'm painting a background petal in. And something you'll see me doing is softening the edges with my brush with damp water and with a paper towel repeatedly. Something I like to try to do is the petals that go back further in space and are more in the background, I try to soften the edges so they will also retreat with edges as well as color. Now here's a bright section. A lot of sun on this little section of petal. And it's going next to some bright colors, and I am softening the edges so it looks, to my eyes, more natural. And so I continue working, glazing colors, building up color, adding sections of color, leaving sections very, very pale, softening the edges between the two. And it's back and forth, and it's consistently the same process as I go through the rest of this painting. This flower is pretty much divided into two halves. And I've just about had one half finished. Adding a little more vein work up to the area where the lightest areas of the flower are bright. Softening, blending. I'll put down a line, and then I'll soften the line, and so it goes. It's a little tricky working around the edges because they are so green. And I don't want to bring a whole lot of green into my bright red petals. Although a little bit looks interesting. A lot just muddies the colors. And I bet you're used to seeing me soften the edges and soften the colors at this point. I'm moving over to the right half of the flower. Now this side of the flower had a huge area of light. It also had a large petal that didn't have as much detail. So it will be interesting to try to figure out just how I want to show it. You can see I've painted lightness and water into the middle section of that petal, and I'm going around the edges with a darker color. I want that middle section to stay lighter, and I've only used a tiny bit of cadmium yellow mixed with my water for that area. While that dries a little bit, I'm back over to the left side, doing some softening on the edges. Now I'm pretty pleased with how some of the shades and the colors, some of the veins, and some of the flower forms are coming out. But I'm not entirely pleased with the composition. I'm sort of determining that I don't know if I like that middle division of the two flowers. Wondering if the flower would look better as one present and not divide into two separate sections. But it's so dark right there where I've painted. I'm not even sure if I can get it lifted. So it would go to a darker flower color. Yeah, I guess you'll see me trying on that one shortly. And back to the flower, softening the section where the lightest colors meet some of the darker sections of the petal. Now, I didn't show myself doing it, but I have lifted a lot of color from that bottom middle section that I was just talking about. Can you see how it almost looks whitish green now? I did that by going over it and over it and over it with a brush and a paper towel and a lot of water. My paper is a very scrubbable arches, and that makes a lot of lifting more possible than some other papers would allow. And I continue to shade and enhance and layer more color onto the petals. Down in that bottom section, I have painted a deep red. I mixed some cadmium red with a little bit of purple. After I got the color in, I softened the edges and then saturated and let another layer and another layer drip in. So the color is quite deep in that particular area, and it did manage to cover the green, except for the idea of maybe some shading. I'm getting toward the end of the painting, but I continue to go around the surface of the paper and adjust and blend and soften edges. Oh, now you might find this interesting. I've decided to add those rays of light up to the top, and I've also decided to remove a little color that was resistant in the background. I first tried to do it by lifting, and when it didn't want to lift, I got out some sandpaper. Sandpaper has to be used on dry watercolor paper, otherwise it just makes a mess. But you can take some of the surface of the paper off, let it be lighter. I don't know if you can make it entirely white again, but generally I've just used it for some gentle blending and some gentle lifting. It roughs up the paper, and it can be helpful to smooth the paper down when you're done with lifting with sandpaper with a smooth object like your fingernail or a plastic spoon and buff it out. I'm trying some folds. I'm trying lifting with some different ways. And then I finally got the idea to use an emory board. Now that's stiff and it's got a hard edge. So I'm lifting some paint along a sun ray line, which is just what I was wanting to do. So it's forming a sort of line. I just have to be careful with the direction I'm going in. There we go. Now it's working the way I want it to. The sandpaper might work better for small spherical areas, but for a line type of area, the emory board seems to be working best. I got the angle wrong and I'm correcting that up there on the section on the top. Signed, and it is done. This was an interesting and fun project. Hope you enjoyed watching me paint Red Flower in the Sun. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up, please. Be sure to write any comments or any questions you may have, and I will really try to answer them for you. There's also some links below that you might want to click on to explore my work and some of the products and things that I do. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you learned something, and I hope you had some fun. See you next painting.